Alfred Barnard is this kind of unique record. There are a few other books in the 19th century that are about whiskey, but they're usually from an excise perspective or from a trade perspective. So the other ones would be like, J.A. Nettleton's book, which is, from the excise talking to the industry about the industry. Whereas Alfred Barnard is for the lay reader. It was published in Harper's Weekly Gazette, a periodical. And it's the first kind of like, well, there might be the whiskey club type folks out there. It's to producer or to customers rather than to producers, and cataloguing the malts of Scotland. And it's written in a very specific time when the railroads had opened up a lot of parts of Scotland. There was a big influx of tourism. There was the great kind of Victorian romance around holidaying in the Highlands. Speyside had been opened up, and it's merged with that kind of romance. There's an awful lot of technical detail in it where he talks about how many gallons a distillery might make, or some of the kit, but it still is infused with this idea of when you see like old travel postcards of come visit such and such. There is this strange, and he was quite open about it. He was quite amazed by some of the landscapes he saw. So it's a book of its times, but it's also a sign of the kind of changing times.
Mm-hmm. And what was he? Why was he documenting all of this? It was just his own interest?
No, so he was commissioned by Harper's Weekly Gazette, which would have been the trade paper of the wines and spirits trade. But again, you get a popular readership. So he had he did another one that the whiskey industry doesn't pay too much attention to, but he did a brewing one as well. And again, they would have appeared as a kind of weekly installments with advertisements for various bits of kits, and these kind of advertisements would be the money making machine for the newspaper, obviously. So they came out as a kind of a series. It was, I think, spring 1885 is when he started, and then they wrapped up by 1887. So it was over. It took a long time. I mean, he visited 129 distilleries in Scotland, 28 in Ireland, and then there were 4 in England. So roughly 150 all told.
Last time I was looking through the book, what's really surprised me about it was how the number of distilleries hasn't really changed that much. There's not a quantum leap or a great change in the number of distilleries. Yeah. The capacity of the distilleries, of course, has changed enormously, and some have closed, some have, about a third, I think, are historic. Yeah. Go way back into the some are just new to the time, and we find that exactly the same today, that about a third are historic from that time, and a third are new, and a third are of medium age. It's curious how everything changes, right, but nothing really changes.
Exactly, yeah. And even when he was coming, of course, some of them, you're talking about the 1880s kind of boom, post-phylloxera. There's a lot of new entrants at the time, and there's some that have been around since the 1823 Act and before. And then similarly, as you say, they've kind of cycled through, and it has, there is a strange symbiosis, well, that's a very pleasant word for it, but the infrastructure of the blending industry had really come on tap then. He starts visiting the grain distilleries, and you see this kind of architecture that creates that pyramid kind of in place is becoming more fixed, and he starts differentiating between self whiskies, which are the kind of ancestor term to single malts, and he says these are self whiskies and these are blending whiskies, and again, we're not quite at the same logic that we have now. It's not as fixed. Labeling laws are a bit of a wild west, but we're starting to see the kind of thinking that whiskey anoractum is built off of, categories, concepts of Campbellton being a region, or the because again, they would talk about the North Country, Campbellton, the Lowlands. No real mention of Speyside as an entity. It's there, but they're still talking about it as kind of the Glenlivet, and it's great to see all these old names where the distilleries are called Aberlour Glenlivet, Macallan Glenlivet.
They still are, actually, but they just don't use the names on the labels, but they still have the Glenlivet appellation on them. I mean, you're a historian, so what's the importance of this book to the present industry?
It's huge. It's a kind of, how would you put it? If not an Old Testament, certainly a kind of a a Rosetta Stone to some of the thinking of the past. You know, we can't know why they were doing things. We just, you know, Alfred Barnard showed up on the day. We don't even know if all of them told him the truth. You know, it's one snapshot, a day in the life. Alfred Barnard rocks up and makes inquiries, but it's still a much harder resource than most of what's out there, other than tax and excise stuff, which can be quite dry, and although it can tell us about like quantities of alcohol distilled, doesn't really tell us a lot about the kind of things being distilled. And we can see, again, it is a historical document as much as a whiskey document. You know, it belongs to its time, that time of, again, a certain kind of Victorian reconciling between a romanticized past and an industrial present, and that's all over the Scotch whisky industry, where, you know, he goes looking for these quaint vistas in Oban and places, and then on the way ends up at Cameron Bridge, looking at unprecedentedly large industrial facilities.
Yeah, I certainly find it useful. I mean, I know it's used when looking at new innovations within the industry, where what's allowed is often has to be traditional, but there's tremendous argument. What do you mean by traditional? Traditional just doesn't mean it's used once or twice way back in some remote part of history. It has to have some sort of living tradition behind it. So it's often used. You know, what is traditional within whiskey making? And given that things have changed, I mean, you see condensers have changed. You know, floors maltings have almost disappeared. Yeast factories have changed. You know, we look after yeast. And the styles of whiskies have changed as well. You know, we have very much more maturing. He never really mentions maturation, warehousing, which is such a big part of the industry now. So you can see that change going on. Do you see that? Back then, there was a big division between the grain distillers and the malt distillers. Is that reflected? Today, they're very much integrated.
Integrated. There's still, you know. And again, of course, they're giving somewhat political answers to Barnard, you know, but you do definitely feel a difference in ethos, certainly. And the grain distillers are very interesting because they kind of fall into two categories. One group are very cautious about dealing with Barnard, and, you know, the most dramatic Avonneal distillery in Belfast. So Belfast, and there's a great myth in Ireland that we turned our back on the column still, but actually Belfast had a huge column distilling industry. There was more column still whiskey coming out of Ireland by the turn of the 20th century than there was pot still. But you know, that has all been written out. That kind of, it was, and even at the time, treated as a kind of a grubby industrialism confined to a city built on industry. You know, a quite unique position in Ireland, that kind of industrial northeast. But there were, you know, there were at least three. There was Connswater, Royal Irish Distillery, and Avonneal. And Avonneal Distillery turned Barnard away. They wouldn't let him, you know, who's this poking around the doors? And you get this idea of a very sketchy operation. And the Dublin pot still distillers were always complaining about Belfast and said, oh, this is all, we don't know where the product is going, this is sketchy. And so you can see there's a certain justification.
Where was the product going? Where was it going?
It was coming over here for the most part. So
it's the big industrial cities.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the murky water between Glasgow and Belfast would have seen an awful lot of, you know, custom stamps on both sides integrated. I mean, eventually, you know, most of those distilleries in the north were bought up by DCL, and there's always the question: what did they do with all this Irish grain whiskey stock? Well, it was a bit blended into Hague, and away they went. You know, it's just a commodity in these. But then similarly, you know, he walks into Connswater, which is another column distillery in Belfast, and they couldn't be prouder that they're column distillers. They're you know, they don't see themselves as whiskey distillers almost. They see themselves as engineers, and they boast about having the latest of everything, the most up to date. We have the most recent patent still model, blah blah blah, which was part of the grain whiskey ethos as well. That it was industrial for better or for worse, you know. And then there's that strange, you know, when he visits some of the pot still distilleries, he goes on about how they resemble the chateau of Bordeaux, and, you know, this kind of misty-eyed, kind of, you know, strange, you know, vineyards of the north kind of language. But it's all part and parcel. But there is that strange, who's willing to play ball and who's, you know, and of course, you know, in the background to this, you get, again, you know, the What is Whiskey trial, the Royal Commission is only 20 years down the line. So all of that politics is going on in the background of who's willing to play ball and who's not, and you know, all those tensions are boiling. just again a decade before Barnard, the Dublin pot still distillers had put out a book called Truths About Whisky, which was basically a polemic against grain whisky and column distilling in general. And it's a great book because it's so insulting. It says, the product is plastic to the hand of the compounder and can be sold as sham brandy or sham rum or sham whiskey or honest doctor stuff. But so it's all there, and you can see that diversity, because he visits everybody, you can see that kind of diversity of opinions, It's so kind of ephemeral, and what we're left with is, these little bits. And so like Barnard is important, but it's only one part of the puzzle. And again, distillery archives are another part of the puzzle, and nothing is complete, and we're left to kind of draw. Customs and excise records are another part, and we're kind of, once in a while you get little blips that will illuminate something. You think, oh my God, how deep does this water go, but all you get are chance remarks or this or that, but they're important, and I think yesterday we were talking about the kind of clinical amnesia of the whiskey industry, and one thing archives are great for is just re-establishing certain facts and saying, well, you actually did do this. Because we get it, people are very resistant to talking in more nuanced terms about the past, because we've got a lot of grand narratives. We've got a lot of stories about, well, this happened, and the Highland line was drawn, and that created this, and that created that, and this great kind of domino effect history, and anything that falls outside that domino path is not to be looked at. And you say, well, this also happened, and someone did this once, and tried this out, and this and that. History is a history of experimentation. And you can almost give people the jitters when you. I remember telling a distillery that a distillery was kind of a big part of their point of differentiation is being very light and unpeated, and I showed them some records of where they had advertised themselves as peat flavored, and it can be very odd, and I think it's diversity is the spice of life, let alone the spice of whiskey, and there's a lot. It's not to be shied away from, and there's so much there to pull from, I
don't know. Noticed, since I joined the industry, so 30 odd years ago, big change. Most of the companies, what they're really interested in, apart from the manufacturing side of it, is the marketing side of it, and that's looking forward and being modern and trying to get to reach new consumer groups and get product out to them, and that was done in the past by kind of looking to the past, and that sort of Highland mythology was used very strongly.
Down the Rushy Glen
down
kind
the
of
Rushy
looks.
Glen, and you get it's the magic of the air, the water, or whatever. You see a big change that really we don't do that nearly so much now. We're very much based on actual manufacturing process, what's actually happens, which is, to me, is as interesting as the mythology, if you like, which has kind of disappeared away. But you see in Barnard's book, that mythology was still there, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think, again, at the back of the book there are these wonderful ads, and they're almost as interesting as the book itself. These strange, again, ads for various brands, but you see some of the imagery, yes. Roderick Dhu, and this kind of, Jacobite-looking fellow in the kilt with the sabre. But of course it says, Wright and Grieg, Glasgow, sole proprietors. That's clearly an industrial facility. This is a blend made in Glasgow. It's got nothing to do with Roderick up here in his finery. But I think it became all the more important at a time where Scotch whisky was industrialising to a scale that had, two things were happening at once. One, the column still, and more than the column still alone, the development of a blended infrastructure. And yes, there was rough edges and certain people weren't willing to play ball, but that was starting to emerge, that kind of thinking. And so you start seeing consistency on a large scale that hadn't been there. You see scale itself that hadn't been there. You also see the kind of dirty water of a lot of column still stuff that wasn't for the blenders, that was just leaking out as basically new make, rot gut. All of this is happening at once. And then, of course, phylloxera and the hit on the brandy and cognac market has given Scotch whisky a new audience that, and it's becoming respectable. You have also you have a lot more people drinking at home. In the 1880s, you have Gladstone's Acts, the the facilitation of respectable middle class drinking. And all of this is tied up with the branding of Scotch whisky to appeal to the Rushy Glen, because if it's not the Rushy Glen, it's the dirty alley out the back in Glasgow, you know, and
I wonder, you know, there was a big rise of the industrial cities at that time, and a lot of the workers there would be first, second generation living in the city, and they would have come from the Highlands and you know, from the more rural, poorer parts of Scotland to try and make their way in the city. And I wonder if that was some sort of, by then, even they were having some romance of thinking that's the way Granddad and Grandma used to live, you know. And so we're sharing a bit of that heritage by having this whiskey.
I was in a pub once and I saw some old ad, and it was some long forgotten blend. I don't remember the name of it, and it shows some, you know, Victorian Scotsman, well-to-do, you know, dressed like a Victorian, but you know, comfortable looking, and he's having some sort of a dream, and in his dream his father, you know, his ancestor with the bonnet, and you know, is there drinking. He says, you know, the drams his fathers loved, you know, and of course the whole thing is a fraud. You know, the drams his father, whatever, like, you know, herbally compounded, you know, Ushkava was being drunk in, you know, the Glenlivet in the 1700s is not the blended product that, you know, this man is enjoying in this pub. But again, this appeal to, and I think part of that came from a certain, not necessarily insecurity, but a need, a necessity. And so, for instance, like you look at brandy and cognac advertising from the time, and it is not trying to sell France. France doesn't need to sell France, or cognac doesn't need to sell France. It just sells cognac, you know. And I think Scotch whisky entered that space more comfortably over time, where it didn't need to sell its Scottishness, it sold its whiskiness, you know. And but again, you're looking at this period of tremendous, I mean, it's the birth of a lot of branding strategies that we've seen today. You know, even, I mean, if there's one great, you know, commercial history of the early 20th century, there's one long arc, it's the rise of international products and international brands, and that a Johnny Walker will taste the same in Hong Kong as it will in Edinburgh, as it will in New York, you know. And it's all the more important to have these labels and these iconic, identifiable products. We've now gone backwards and kind of romanticized, you know, the drams his father loved, you know, these, you know, whatever rough and ready artisan products. But at the same time, when Barnard was writing, yes, there were the self whiskies and there was a certain kind of cult around them, but there was also just an awful lot of rotgut that people didn't know it was coming from and were very insecure about purchasing something.
I certainly had the privilege of looking back and tasting some very old whiskies from the 1800s. Not a lot survives because it's quite volatile, so it's quite difficult to keep it sealed in a bottle. But there are examples from the early 1900s, from when Barnard was writing, Victorian whiskies. The stuff that survives is all the good stuff. Nobody has kept the bottles. So unfortunately, we don't know what the cheap mass whiskey was like. We know what the good stuff was like, and it was very similar actually to today. Certainly not nearly matured as much as it is today. It would be looked upon as quite young. You know, the Shackleton whiskey, for instance, that was discovered under Shackleton's hut. That was about 5-year-old, and that was the best whiskey that distillery could make, you know, because you're giving it to the Imperial Antarctic expedition, so you know that's the best that they're making, but it's 5-year-old.
Yeah, I mean,
and it's also made with some wheat in it as well, you know. So it's but it's really tastes really good. It smells really good.
Maturation itself has come out of, you know, necessity as much as anything. You know, when whiskey wasn't selling, it sits there aging. And yeah, similarly in Ireland, you know, the Bow Street distillery, which would have been again kind of the creme de la creme of the industry, when they said, you know, not a drop sold till it's 7 years old, would have been this enormous statement of intent. You know, my God, it's 7 years old. You know, but again, the metrics have changed. You know,
I mean, there's a plethora of books now, like Barnard, you know, people describing, rating different distilleries, different whiskies, but they're all really are Barnard is the first. And I would suggest the best of these books.
The first influencer in whiskey, you know, they're clamoring at the doors these days, you know, armed with various hashtags, you know, but if you want to blame one man